It's terrific to be here. Needless to say, we're very excited to have Graydon Carter with us. He also needs no introduction. Coming to New York from Ottawa, beginning his career in time and life, moving on to really create something that was new to New York City, co-found SPY in 1986. The Observer, I think, really was transformed from what was a sleepy weekly into the must-read for the New York elite, and then a real renowned career at Vanity Fair for 25 years. Latest project of Airmail, I think I want to start there, but first I want to start by welcoming you. I think it's a big treat for all of us. Tell us about your... Go ahead. So before we get to Airmail, which is the newest project and a digital weekly for what I think of as a global citizen, love to hear from you about your first job, the first one that you had.
Well, actually, my first job really was, I had a magazine in Canada that we started in college that did nothing but lose money. It was a political magazine and a political literary magazine that had really no real point to it, and as a result, after 5 years, we sold it to our closest competitor. I came to New York and I actually worked for Louise Grunwald, who's sitting over there. I went to work for her husband, Henry Grunwald, who was the editor-in-chief of Time Incorporated, and worked as a writer at Time magazine. Strangely enough, where I met Alessandra Stanley, who's sitting over there beside Louise, about 39, 40 years ago, and she's my co-editor at Airmail.
Well, then I have clearly got...
She's the only person I've ever met. I've known her for 40 years. The only person I've ever met in 40 years, she never told me she went to Harvard.
Is that right?
Yes.
Within
there
the first 2
are
minutes.
people who tell you in 40 seconds after meeting.
Within the first 2 minutes.
40
yeah.
years.
Yeah. Well, then I was clearly misinformed because I was under the impression that your first jobs were more blue-collar oriented.
Oh, no. In Canada, there's a tradition of like the parents send you out to toughen you up. I worked on the railroad for 7 months before college. I was a ski instructor, and not a great one, but I was a ski instructor. Oh, the great. No. So there's a thing in Canada where I grew up. The ground gets really cold fast. So by November, you can't put bodies in the ground. So they wait until May when things thaw, and they hire high school kids to come and dig graves because you got a lot of bodies to get in the ground because they've been storing them all winter long. So I went to this, there's a place called the Eastview Cemetery, and I dug graves for a day. I did it, and I thought, that's it, I'm not going to do any more of this. But my parents were always pushing us out to get experiences.
I figured for this intimate group, these were facts that were not more widely publicized. But having moved on into the literary world, a big topic for David Millstone, my partner, and I in our business, which is not thought of as the sexiest business in the world, has been the lack of...
Oh, really?
Really?
Roofing.
Well,
I think roofing is very sexy.
Well, let me put it this way. There's a very small, discrete group of people in the world who think roofing is sexy. Yeah. We happen to be one of them. Right. But not a lot of disruption transformation. I've always had the impression that the media business broadly, maybe not magazines specifically, have had to reinvent themselves and disrupt themselves. Having founded or co-founded SPY in '86 and now here in 2019 with Airmail, am I right? Am I wrong? Has it really changed the landscape? And if so, what do you think Airmail has really set out to do differently and solve problems that traditional media has been more struggling with?
I mean, if you take media as a whole, the fact is that the movies, they start off, they are silenced, then you bring in sound, and half the actors who had squeaky voices, the male actors have squeaky voices, their careers are dashed. Then it goes from black and white to color movies. That TV gobbled up a lot of radio, and yet look, radio's as strong as ever. Streaming television has made great changes to broadcast television. And funny enough, my job, what I do, I had a magazine, I guess it was almost 50 years ago, that the job I do now is not appreciably different than the job I had then. As an editor, your job is, you're sort of like a choir director, and you want a lot of voices, but you sort of want them to sing slightly in harmony. Your job is to make it sort of work together. And I believe in story. I like storytelling, and the fact is that a great piece of journalism should have like 3 elements to it: disclosure. I mean facts that are unknown up to that point. Narrative. I mean a story arc. And access, which is often sometimes helpful, and that was the same 60 years ago, and it's the same. It's the same now. It's just a matter of delivery. When we started Spy Magazine, it was a New York magazine. It was monthly. It was a satirical nonfiction magazine about New York, with a very particular voice, taken in large part from Time, which used to be very dense, adjective-heavy language, but we sort of made it funny. But we planned on selling 25,000 copies a month, and it grew faster than we expected, and it caused, it's a lot of work to print magazines, ship them out around the country, wait until they see if they've been sold. They come back, they tear off the covers of the unsold copies. And the whole process takes about 90 days, and you see no money during that period. The fact is, if we could have done this electronically and pressed a button, and it's available to everybody in the world right away, we would never have printed anything.
Right. I get that part of the equation. Talk to me a little bit about your thoughts of what I always consider to be one of the big debates that kind of flip-flopped over the years about content versus distribution and the value of content and distribution. It feels like that debate maybe has actually been settled, and the democratization of distribution has changed the world in so many different ways.
Like anybody in the olden days, you had to work for somebody who had the the means of power to get your voice out. Now anybody can be a publisher.
Sure.
It's actually, there are too many people, too many voices out there some days. But the fact is, you can open your shop anywhere, and the world is available. You just got to get to attract people to it, which means you have to have something to say.
I think one of the things I struggle with myself personally is just there's the volume of content and the push-pull thing, and just how much shows up in your inbox. I think I know the answer to your question, but what is the way to sort of curate, sort all the volume that's out there? Because you get into the fake news, real news debate. On one angle, but just beyond that, there's only so many hours in the day. How do you really sort of sort through?
I mean, I literally, in 50 years of being in the magazine business, I've never done a readership study, and I do it largely by gut. What works and what doesn't. And with airmail, we get digitally, you get a matrix that shows you like what the most read stories. But like, for instance, I was when we were at Vanity Fair, John Galliano, who was a big designer, one of the great fashion designers, he went on a rant in a Paris bar that was caught on video, and his career was dashed. And I thought for Vanity Fair, getting him to talk, it would be a great story. And Ingrid Sishi, who I worked with at the time, she and I spent a year and a half, almost 2 years on this. And we got the story. Andy Leibovitz took the picture, and this man had been crushed. This had sort of finished off his career. And of our 1.5 million readers, probably 10,000 people read that story, but they really read it. And the other, 1,400,000 odd probably just flipped through the page and didn't know who he was. But those 10,000 people were people in the fashion business and presumably advertisers. So you build the kind of magazine I run. It's more of a general interest magazine. Spy was, Vanity Fair was. This is general interest. You make up your audience through various packets. I happen to love crime stories. Perhaps not everybody does. I happen to love cartoons. We have Bob Mankoff, who used to be the cartoon at the New Yorker, who's our cartoon editor. I love stories of rich neighbors fighting each other, and we try to have one of those in every...
Never runs out of
the royal
volume.
family, the British royal family was I found it so boring up to a certain point. Now, this next generation, they're very different, and they're not getting along, and And so I think that it's all of a sudden it became interesting after like 100 years of not being that interesting. So we basically, Alessandra and I and the other editors, we go with our taste.
Yeah.
And if a humor piece amuses us, we figure it might amuse others. We love like listening to podcasts or watching Netflix shows and recommending them to you that you may not have seen.
Let's pause right there. We would love some recommendations.
No, my wife and I are listening to a podcast now called Tunnel 29. It's about this group of students that dug a tunnel underneath the Berlin Wall. And they'd escaped from East Berlin. They get into West Berlin, but they want to go back and get friends. So they tunneled back from West Berlin into East Berlin. And it was done by the same group that did this podcast called Ratlines, which was done by Philippe Sands, who was he's a very prominent civil rights attorney in Europe. He had written stories to me at Vanity Fair, and he did something called Ratlines that Alessandra recommended to me. And it's about how they got the high command of the Nazis out of Germany after the war, through the Vatican and down into South America. It was like it's gripping stuff.
That's good. That's good stuff. Harkening back a little bit to what you were saying about a good magazine article, 3 dynamics: disclosure, narrative,
And access.
And access. Talk to me about mystery. I think we talked about this a little bit before. I mean, how important has mystery been in the world, and it existing, and you and others uncovering mystery? And how much of the mystery is just gone in the world of Instagram and everything else that really has diluted things to commodities?
Well, we were talking about earlier, like one of the things we did, as an editor, I'd be working on like about 100 stories at any given time. And then people would call with story ideas, and you'd sort of farm them out to editors. So I get a call one day from this lawyer, and he says, I represent Deep Throat. And for those younger people out there, Deep Throat was a famous source during the Watergate. The young man like that fellow with their glasses. But this was one of the abiding mysteries of American contemporary culture. So he calls and he says, I represent the man who is Deep Throat. So I farm him off to an editor at the magazine, David Friend, and he meets with him, and the problem was this person was also going into a slide of dementia. So you couldn't be 100% sure. So we work on this for 2 years, and we photograph him. You know his name now. His name is Mark Felt. But we weren't 100% sure that this was Deep Throat, because there's only one person two people who could tell you. One's Carl Bernstein and one's Bob Woodward. And Carl worked at Vanity Fair at the time, but I didn't want to call him because I knew he'd call Bob, and Bob would get it in the paper before us, because we weren't coming out for another 20 odd days as we closed it. I get married. My wife and I go on a honeymoon. I'd forgotten all about this. We'd closed the story, and we're in the airport in the Bahamas, and I didn't have a cell phone in those days, and my wife gets a call, and it's David Friend on the line saying, we're releasing this story today to the world. And this is a period during the Bush administration where if you made a big mistake, your career was just over. So I was really anxious. We had about 40 minutes before we boarded the flight and back to New York. So we waited, and David called and said that Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein were going to make an announcement at like 4 o'clock, and we were getting our flight. We'd be getting on the flight around then. Mm-hmm. And Anna, my wife's the battery of her phone it was an old flip phone, wearing down. I just thought, holy Jesus, I've just had a lovely honeymoon. I'm going back, and this could be one of the worst experiences of my life. And then just literally as we're going to the gate, David calls and said, Woodward and Bernstein just confirmed that this is Mark Felt. And the relief of getting on that plane knowing that I didn't screw this up was just absolutely enormous. And it was on the front page of every newspaper in the world the next day.
Unbelievable.
So,
not knowing how this works, I mean, I would imagine that's a pretty competitive process to get a story.
Well,
like
this
that.
just fell into our lap.
How did that happen? That's what I'm curious about.
I mean, things get screwed up. Jane Sarkin was here. She used to book our covers and the big portfolios we'd do. And one time I wanted to shoot, I like group shots, so we wanted to shoot all the Bond girls in one photograph up to that point. They were all still alive. And so this takes place over 2 or 3 months, getting them, making arrangements for them to come to New York. Annie Leibovitz was going to take their picture. And there was one who we didn't get her, and Jane said, it's Claudine Lange. I said, no, we've got to get her. Claudine Lange was the woman who was married to, for you younger people, married to a man called Spider Savage, who was an American Olympic skier, and she shot him. And but I said, no, you got to get Claudine Lange. So she said she wants to be flown over on the Concorde. So you're putting this huge puzzle. The guy said, okay, she can come over, and we'll fly her back on a regular flight. So we put her up at the Carlisle. We had a lot of money in those days. And we put her up at the Carlisle, and then the day of the shoot, Jane comes to me and says, she won't come out of her room. I said, you've got to be kidding me. So we've got to have Claudine Lange. She goes, no, her name's not Claudine Lange, it's Claudine Lange. And this is before the internet. So I said, she was the one who married to Spider Savage. She goes, no, she's just a sort of semi-successful French actress. I said, she won't come out of her trailer. I said, you just tell her she got to come out of her trailer, and you give her an economy class ticket home. And so that way, you can't. That's something where you plan it out like as much as you can, and something like this just falls into your lap.
Unbelievable. I understand there's certain words that were always banned at Vanity Fair and airmail. Any you can share with us?
No, it's just there's nothing that drives me crazier than a writer when they have dialogue and they don't want to use the word said over and over, and so they go, he guffawed, or they chortled. Anyway, anything like that just drives me crazy. I like a simple language that's not flowery, like when a writer calls a book a tome, or somebody pens a book rather than writes a book, or a restaurant's a boîte rather than a restaurant. That kind of pretentious language. So there's a long list of words.
There's a long list.
Yeah, it gets longer every day.
I'm taking note of it.
Yeah.
To not use. In the battle for content that exists in the world, at first I thought your answer would be who's going to curate all that content. I thought the answer was going to be airmail.
Okay. Well, we try.
Yeah. Apple, Amazon, Netflix, huge sort of fight out there to command the streaming wars. Any thoughts on, I guess how that plays out over time? Apple in particular, who's been spending.
Yeah, I mean, the Apple people came to us before we launched, and they wanted us to go on Apple News Plus. I'm sure you have it, where you pay us $9.99 a month or whatever it is. And I said, I don't want to be. I'd like to see how this works out first before I do it. And I subscribed to Apple News Plus, and it doesn't really appeal to me. It reduces everything rather than expands everything. It makes everything look much the same. And the fact is, editors matter, and an editor is much like a chef. You can, if you want to have a quiche Lorraine tonight, you can go to Whole Foods and get the ingredients and get a New York Times cooking app and put it together. Or you can go to a lovely restaurant where they've done all the work for you. And that's what editors do, is we try to entertain you and inform you, give you stories that you may not have read elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Being somebody who travels a bunch and consumes content way too much, in addition to being an editor, obviously you've been a tremendous restaurateur, producer, documentary filmmaker. Anything you can tell us about an upcoming project on the documentary side that would be the group?
The thing is, and funny, they're all an extension of the same thing. Restaurant, I love the restaurant business. It's like live theater every night. I still do the seating with one of my associates at the magazine. 15 years after we bought the Waverly Inn, we just make sure people are seated nicely. And documentary filmmaking is just like is basically like it's basically like putting a magazine together. And I fell into that by mistake. David Friend again. These two young filmmakers. They were French. They were making a film about a rookie firefighter, and they were in the World Trade Center towers when the planes hit. and because they went in with this the firefighter, and they just kept shooting as the buildings were coming down. They lived, and so they showed us some footage, and I said, this is before Netflix or anything like that, and I called up Les Moonves, who was running CBS, and I said, and Andrew Hayward was head of the news division. I said, we'd like to show you this footage. It's pretty remarkable. And we showed them like 45 minutes of it, and these two guys were really brave. And so I said to we can do this. It's got to be Sunday night, no commercial interruptions. You don't want Sani pads and paper towel ads in the middle of this. And it can't be fronted by a CBS person. It's got to be fronted by Bob De Niro, who lived down in Tribeca. So they agreed to everything, and it was shown in 110 countries, and we won Emmy Awards and Peabody Awards. I barely did anything. Much like the magazine, as my staff would tell you.
That's a win. That's a win. That's a win. So I know you've been spending a lot of time in Europe. You've been a global citizen for a long time. Mm-hmm. We can tread very lightly in the political arena, mm-hmm. but how do you think of the current sort of, global fight between being a global citizen and nativism, which seems to be transcending not just our country, but countries across the world?
Yeah, I think you can do a direct line between the invasion of Iraq, which unnecessary after 9/11, which set off the Arab Spring in that part of the world, the fall of the dictators, the migrant crisis, and then closing up borders and nationalism, and Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. And Alessandra and I were with Boris Johnson's sister the other day, and she said, Boris Johnson, he doesn't really care one way or another about Brexit. He just likes being prime minister. And I think that you want leaders who actually care about something and are there for the common good, rather than a resume buffer.
Is there hope for us? So much of what used to be part of political norms or practices, or even sort of the democratization of distribution, allows everybody to have a voice that's magnified. What's the way through, or is this much more akin to an industrial revolution where it takes an entire generation to really shake it all?
Well, first of all, to me, you start off right off the bat. You cannot have a voice on the internet unless it's you.
Right.
And you have driver's licenses, you've got marriage licenses. You should have to have an internet license where you go in and you prove that this is your identity. And if you want to say something, that's your face and your name on it. You can't do it under a fake name or anything like that.
How does that work for the fake news concept, and whether it's Facebook or anybody else? You think authentic content becomes a requirement on some of these platforms, whether they want to call themselves a platform or not?
In fact, look, there's been fake news. I hate the expression. It's such a lame expression. But you've had sort of bogus news, right, going back to the beginning of newsprint. There's a certain mass of the public that will believe almost anything. And I have great faith in sort of the overall American character. I grew up in Canada, I made a decision to come here. I think America is one of the great nations ever, and we're in a rocky time now, like all liberal democracies are having a rough time. But I think the inherent character of Americans will right the ship. And in America, if you grew up outside of America, in other countries, the pendulum swings like this, but America always swings like this. They had much more fun in the 1960s and 70s than anybody did anywhere else in the world. And then they make more money in the 1980s than anywhere else in the world. Then they go through, they're grungier in the 90s than anybody else in the world. And America just swings wider. And I think that, I don't know where the next swing is going to take us, but it won't be like this in 4 years.
No, I
hope not.
I would hope not. Yeah. But the swings are remarkable. If you're standing outside the States and you look at a country and electorate that goes from a Bush to a Obama to a Trump, that's a pretty schizophrenic set of outcomes.
Yeah, but that's America. And the thing is with populists, with Nixon, with Father Coughlin, who was the great radio priest in the 1930s, populists, the support stays with them, and it's like going bankrupt. It's good. It's slowly, and then all of a sudden. And when that's, the Republican Party, they backed Nixon right up to the point where the tapes were discovered, and then they ran for the hills. And I don't know what it'll take, but I think that most Republicans are as good as Democrats, but the people they've sent to Washington are backing this because they don't know what to do.
Right.
And at some point, that decision will be made for them when something is so egregious that they can't ignore it.
Understood. I want to be a little sensitive to time because I know there's a lot of folks out here who want to ask you questions as well. But one last one that I'm at. Who've been some of the most important mentors to you in your career early on, 25 years at Vanity Fair?
Oh man, no, I've been really fortunate. Well, Henry Grunwald and a lot of it, my partners. I mean, I learned a lot from Alessandra. I had a great partner at Spy magazine. David Halberstam was a great influence on me. I loved working with Christopher Hitchens. I learned a great deal from him. And strangely enough, I think I learned more from my wives than I think both my current wife and my ex-wife. I think that wives are often much wiser than their husbands. I always think that men age like milk, and women age like wine. So, I'm a 2%er.
I'm going to leave it at that. Maybe we'll open it up to the floor. Any questions? I think we have some microphones around. Please, up in front.
What is the difference in the vision that you have for your new publication as opposed to what you did at Vanity Fair? How is the vision different?
Okay, the one thing, and Jane Sorkin doesn't take offense to this, I hated the Hollywood coverage. I think that's just, I'm so done with that. There's nothing that bores me more than movie stars talking about their craft, because I've been in movies as an actor, and I tell you, anybody can do it. It's the easiest thing in the world. It's the only art form where an idiot with no experience can succeed. And so, I mean, you don't have people on the stage here who just stumble in off the street and they're handed a violin and they can play. But, dogs act, so it's not that difficult. That little dog in Cheers, he jumped up on the sofa when he had to.
Ironically, I'm confident I could never actually act, which is...
No, what did you ask me?
It really doesn't matter.
No, what was it? No.
The difference in the vision.
Oh, I see.
When you were at Vanity Fair.
Yes.
You were in Vanity Fair, and now
This is very glow. It's very glow. It's not that different. It's the same sort of vision. It's the worldview, and it's very international, and I think it's lighter. It's more lighthearted. It's sort of a combination between Spy and Vanity Fair a bit. And I think we wanted to create a voice that was, detached, ironic, literate, and something that something to be life affirming. And civilized. Oh, your mother-in-law.
My own. Hi.
Oh.
How are you? Across all your experience with media, from print to digital to even documentary, what are some common themes you found around customer acquisition and building loyalty?
I mean, the customer advantage. I mean, in the print business, I mean, the science of that was so primitive. I mean, you'd create this. You'd work so hard to create these magazines, and you'd hand it off to the weakest link, and then you'd never had any idea what would happen with it. I mean, it's much different than in the digital world, where there are levers to pull. It's something I'm so completely ignorant of, but I understand the value of it. But we have great people at Airmail to marshal the audience. And I'm not looking for a gigantic audience. This is a self-selecting audience. And one thing about Airmail that's different is that when I was at Vanity Fair, I wrote, advertisers gave us about $100,000 a page. And journalism is really expensive, and I really appreciated that. So I wrote a thank you note to the advertisers every single month for 25 years. So when we started Airmail, they were all pretty good to us. And Emily Davis, that came over from Vanity Fair to help with our sponsorship, I decided right at the bat, it drives me crazy when you're trying to read something, even the New York Times, and there's something moving over here, and there's an ad for, that toothbrush or Allbirds down here. And I didn't want anything to move unless you asked it to move. And so we have one sponsor per issue. So which is a great thing for the advertiser. They like it. It means there's a safety factor to that. So we sold out 6 months of advertising before we started. And so you can control things a little better this way. And I actually prefer it to putting out a monthly magazine.
Ron?
My question, Mr. Carter, is about the bias right now in the media and lack of editorial oversight, and I feel it keenly in the attacks that have been made, for example, on trustees of philanthropic institutions, and factually incorrect, looking into people's investing habits in totally legal ways, and how you feel about this trope of singling out philanthropists for scrutiny and very often incorrect
Well,
information.
you separate between something like the Sacklers, who have a company that killed, hundreds of thousands of people.
That's different.
And their philanthropy. And I've completely forgotten this, but a reporter from ProPublica called me, and he was doing a story on the Sacklers, and I'd forgotten that when they opened the Sackler wing of the Serpentine Gallery in London, that Mike Bloomberg and I were the hosts of that dinner. So I think the fact is, first of all, most of the artists that perform, if you're or say any artists who are in the Met or MoMA, the chances are those artists were not perfect people either. I mean, and I think take the money and run. And if you're talking, I don't know what.
As president of MoMA, I quite agree with you.
But the fact is, publications like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, they live and die by their credibility. They're not going to screw around with things that they don't believe they can back up. And not all journalists, but most journalists who work in things that most of us read, they really make an effort to get the story right. And when I was at Vanity Fair, I always took every single phone call where somebody can complain, because I thought went through 2 enormous libel suits, and they went on for years, and they're draining. And we won one, lost one. And but I would pick up the phone if somebody had a complaint. And our readers, they were really, really nice. I got really nice hate mail, because it was like a woman writing me from Palm Springs or saying, "Dear Mr. Carter," said, "I love your magazine, but you got to lay off our president." So it was just really polite hate mail by and large. But I'd pick up the phone if they called me.
Where else are we? Don't be shy, everybody. One over here.
So one of the things that you shared early in your career at Vanity Fair was kind of the simple philosophy that simply said, if I was interested in something, we wrote a story because we figured others would be interested in it as well. In the new endeavors in your career and today, has that philosophy changed at all?
No, not one whit. And
how do you ensure that the work really kind of lives into that every single day?
You can't. There's no guarantees of anything, and we used to you'd do things. Funny, in a magazine, the way it looked in a planning room, where you'd be looking at dubbings of pages, and then you'd look at it in page proofs, and then when it was finally printed, a story could look very different. And the number of times where it looked great in one situation, and by the time the thing was bound and printed, you realize that this is a catastrophic mistake. And so there's no guarantees about anything, and you just do your best. And I literally, there's almost nothing we run that I or the editors feel, this is interesting. I think, and a colleague of mine at Time, his name was John Leo, and he he always said, stories should have nudgeability. And I said, what does that mean? He said, a husband and wife are sitting in bed, and one's reading a magazine, and they go, hey, Mabel, did you see this story? And I think you need nudgeability in anything you do so that it's, I didn't know that, Trump had done this when he was 18, that sort of thing.
Where else are we?
So I have a question more about social media and online. I think just knowing how crowded the digital news space is, what do you think the most challenging aspect of competing for consumers' attentions online is?
Well, I think that I tell my staff, this is not going to grow like quality takes time to grow. Say like Brunello Cucinelli, the Italian designer, makes cashmere things. I mean, he makes beautiful, beautiful things. But he probably only became known to most of us in the last 5 or 10 years. He's been doing it for 40 years. And I mean, if you wanted to give Kim Kardashian's reading list, I can't imagine what that would be. But if you would get a lot of activity on social media, but they would just come for that 1 second and disappear. We put Madonna on the cover of Vanity Fair 8 times. And each time we put her on, I mean, it became diminishing returns over the years. But each time we put it on, there'd be a big spike in the circulation. And those people were one-issue readers. They were Madonna nuts, and they'd buy that issue, and they wouldn't come back the next month. And the trick is to build it up over, to develop trust with the reader that, you're going to surprise them, but you're not going to trick them, that you're going to give them something that you think is of value, and you hope they'll give you a little bit of money in return. And I mean, the social media world is just, that's a whole other division of whatever media is, but that's not what I traffic in.
Thought I'd seen one right. Yeah, Peter.
You talked about the need for individuals to take responsibility for what they write or put online, et cetera. What role, if any, do you think the large tech companies should play in moderating the content that appears on their platform, including the advertisements?
Oh, I think that I don't think it should be broken up necessarily, but I do think verification of who you are and what you are would solve a million problems. And if your organization is like a Russian-based, and you want to take advertising on Facebook, a reader should be able to touch a button and find out the details of that. And I just think that would solve a million problems, because now it's haywire. I don't think any of the big tech companies are in it for the public good at all. They're in it for the money. But by and large, over the decades, publishers, by and large, you go into journalism for 3 reasons. I mean, to do good work, to have a great time, and to make a little bit of money. But the money is usually the third thing. And most of the great newspapers in this country, up until recently, were owned by individuals. They're owned by the Sulzberger family, the LA Times family. I can't remember the name of them. But these were family businesses, and the reputations of their papers affected how the public would see the family. Google and Facebook are there. I know people use Google 50 times a day, but you don't feel that they're doing anything in your interest. You're not the client. You're the product.
Yeah. Anyone else from out here? One in the back.
Hi. Given the struggle with journalism, with shrinking departments and budgets, and the high cost to do quality journalism, such as sending reporters overseas, how do you think people can be competitive in this market but still maintain the quality of journalism that is high manpower?
Well, it's difficult. In the print business, two things happened in the print business. Is in like around 2008, you had the financial crisis, and somehow just advertising just disappeared. And because if you're, rather than laying off people when your company's having a rough time, it's much easier to cut back on your advertising spend. And that was a devastating blow to both newspapers and magazines. A lot of this is stupidity on the part of the publishers. Newspaper publishers let Craigslist run away with the classified advertising business. Classified ads, that's what kept newspapers alive over the last 100 years. It's not the display ads. A page of classifieds is worth 5 times what a page of display advertising is to a newspaper. And it's in the same way that Brooks Brothers let Ralph Lauren walk away with their business, or so it's very difficult. And Airmail is one of the few digital publications that is fact-checked and copy-edited, and that's a big difference. Some magazines don't have that at all. At Vanity Fair, we would have sometimes 40 fact-checkers working to close an issue, and even then, we get small things wrong, but by and large, we didn't get big things wrong.
Thank you. For all of us, this is a real treat, and appreciate having your
Treat for
time.
me.
For those who haven't subscribed to Airmail, obviously I've been a big fan of Graydon, and in particular what he did with the Observer and Vanity Fair for 25 years. So every Saturday morning, 6 a.m., you know I'm up. So I read it, and I would suggest all of you subscribe immediately. So thank you for that. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Oh.